Hello, welcome to Form and Function from Afar. We really appreciate you being here for the conference. I'm Andrew Hewitt, one of the instructors for Book, Paper, Thread, and I'll be the moderator for this session, which is Noah Smutz on preparing boards for conservation treatments. We are really glad to have you here to be part of 3 days of presentations and demonstrations by some of the most interesting and inspiring artists and craftspeople of our community. Form and Function from Afar was conceived late last year when all of the conferences and events that normally take place were canceled due to the pandemic. We were missing interacting with our community and thought maybe 50 or 100 people might join us online to get together and for sharing techniques, resources, and ideas. We've been really excited to see how many of you, over 1,750 people so far, have registered for the conference and how many have been introducing themselves and their work in the portal, connecting with friends and colleagues and making new connections. We hope you continue that throughout the next few days. I want to cover a few things about how this Zoom webinar will be run. This is slightly different than a Zoom meeting, which you may be more familiar with. Since we have a large audience, attendees will not be connected by video, but you can certainly ask questions and make comments. There are two avenues for that, the chat and the Q&A section, which you should see along the bottom of your screen. We have assistants monitoring both. We will use the chat for sharing links to things that the presenter mentions during their talk, and the Q&A is where you can ask a question. We will either type a response there or the presenter may answer that question live. So Q&A for the questions and chat for any comments. At this point, if you want to go ahead, take some time while I'm talking, if you want to introduce yourself and maybe say where you're from. It's always exciting to see how far our reach is. If you think of a question after the fact, there is space to post follow-up questions and to continue the conversation on the conference website. Lastly, if you experience issues connecting to or other technical trouble, don't despair. This session is being recorded and will be available to view first on our conference website at that webinar tab, and later at Book, Paper, Thread's YouTube channel. If you miss anything, you can circle back and rewatch any of the webinars. I'll introduce Noah in a minute and hand it over to him, but first I wanted to acknowledge our sponsors who made it possible for us to offer this virtual conference for you all for free. We have 10 fabulous sponsors listed on our conference website. Please check out what they're sharing in the virtual vendor fair and see what they have to offer by following the links to their websites. Don't forget that some of the sponsors are offering discounts to conference attendees, so be sure to see their listings in the virtual vendor fair. I'd like to tell you a bit about Book, Paper, Thread. We are a collaboration, myself, Andrew Hewitt, Karen Hardy, and Linda Marshall. When all of our in-person teaching gigs were canceled or postponed last year, we realized we'd have to change the way we taught. We met regularly to share our ideas and resources and how best to do that remotely. We launched our first online workshops last August and have been growing our catalog of courses, learning how to do it better each time we teach. We cover a variety of topics in book and paper arts and offer different styles of workshops, from pre-recorded sessions over 6 weeks to live weekend workshops. We hope you'll be interested in exploring a workshop with us at some point. So now I'm going to go ahead and introduce Noah. Noah is a book conservator and the owner of NS Conservation, LLC in St. Louis. Noah has been in the field of conservation since 2011, when he started as a student worker at the University of Kansas Library's Conservation Lab. He has since held internships for the Smithsonian Archives and the Bodleian Library, amongst others. He graduated with his master's degree in book conservation from Westdean College in the United Kingdom. Previously, he had worked as a book conservator for the Smithsonian Libraries before going into private practice. Noah has worked with institutions such as the St. Louis Art Museum, the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art, the Missouri State Archives, and the Missouri History Museum. He has been a member of the American Institute for Conservation since 2010 and a professional associate since 2019.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us here today for this fantastic conference organized by Andrew, Linda, and Karen. Today, I will be discussing with you lifting materials off of book boards to prepare them for conservation treatment. I am going to share my PowerPoint now, and we'll get started. So first off, we're going to get into reasons for lifting. And to start that discussion, we really need to start with why we lift and what lifting is. So lifting is the process of delaminating the covering material from a book board or separating part of the board from itself below the covering material. This is usually accomplished with a sharp tool of some description. And as a conservator, I'm not trying to trick anyone into believing an object that I've worked on has not been repaired. However, if I can minimize the visual appearance of my work, I will. And lifting material is what allows me to blend my work into the appearance of the object. Lifting is an interventive treatment. It is a change to the underlying structure of the book, and while it is possible to retreat items with lifted covering material, it is impossible to truly reverse the process. That said, the benefits of lifting material, strengthening and rebuilding the structure, are worth the high level of intervention present in these types of repairs. So the main reason that I find myself lifting material is to do rebacks. A reback is the creation of a new spine in the appropriate material applied to the book. The three that you can see in this corner are all leather rebacks, and then these two are Japanese paper rebacks. And most of the time when I'm at this stage where I'm doing the reback and putting the new material on, it's really more an aesthetic treatment to make the book look right, because I've done the structural work underneath, and the reback also allows me to hide that work, whether that's a bright white spine lining or something of that description. Another reason to lift material is to do an end sheet hinge repair, where you are reinforcing the end sheet joint. And you can do a repair that has the Japanese paper hinge on each side of that joint, but it can look much tidier and can greatly lessen the appearance of the repair if you lift the paste down and put part of it underneath there. Just simple board attachment can be another reason. That can be lifting small areas for sutures or joint tacketing. Additionally, you may lift the end sheet on a case binding, or the paste down on a case binding, in order to recreate the appropriate board attachment on the inside face of the board. And then lastly, it can be done to preserve the covering material while replacing the boards. This is not, I would say, a common occurrence, but sometimes the covering cloth or leather in a water event where the board is waterlogged can be salvaged and be put onto a new board. There are alternatives to lifting. The first that comes to mind is the Etherington Japanese paper joint repair. This was detailed in the Abbey newsletter, volume 19, number 3 from August 1995. I mentioned this in the handout that's available, and this is available for free to download from the Cool Conservation Archive. So in this repair technique, a Japanese paper hinge that sometimes is backed with a solvent set or heat set adhesive is applied over the broken joint of a leather binding, and it completely removes the need for lifting. It is a very quick treatment to do. In my experience, it works best on smaller books with lighter boards. The structural requirements of a repair for books with heavier boards, I think, go beyond what this repair can achieve. And then other places I've seen concerns with this repair are if the leather that's below it is too degraded. When you adhere that strip down, the grain layer may just lift away and it will fail. Or the repeated mechanical action of opening and closing the board will cause the adhesive to fail, causing the repair to fail. And this book down here in the corner is an example of that type of repair with a Japanese paper hinge laid over the joint. The next option is board slotting. Over the past several decades, many binders and conservators have devised ways to modify benchtop milling machines or make a jig to hold an angle grinder or a similar tool in order to cut an angled slot in the spine edge of the board. The most well-known currently is probably Jeff Peachy's board slotting machine, which is in the picture here. Slotting is an efficient and effective treatment. It allows for the original covering material not to be disturbed. You don't have to lift it. Because you are removing original material, there is space for that repair material to sit without adding bulk to the board, but you are removing original material that can't be put back. It's not a treatment that can be done twice. Once you cut a slot, that's all there is. Book boards range usually between 2 and 3 millimeters thick, so there's not a lot of room there to do another slot. Additionally, the equipment is specialized and can be expensive, so you really have to have a workflow to justify having a machine like this on hand. And then the last option is board slitting, which is similar to slotting, but you're not removing any material. You are instead splitting the board either on an angle like you would with slotting or at the midpoint so that you can insert material into it. And this doesn't You can still create a bump in this regard versus slotting, but it is another way to do board attachment. Sometimes it has to be paired with secondary lifting so that you can cover that thin piece of the board that is above the slit. So the materials we will be discussing today are, and demoing, lifting on, are cloth-covered boards, both a completely detached board, as well as how to lift when the case is still together. It could be like the case in the picture here. The case is off the book, but is in relatively good shape, but the cloth, especially at the joints, is worn, and reinforcing that would be helpful. And the best way to do that is to be able to lift the boards, to put a piece of Japanese paper underneath on both boards, as well as lining the entire spine piece of cloth. For lifting leather, the thickness of the leather that you're dealing with really helps determine the best way to lift that leather. If it's a thicker leather, you can usually get away with lifting just the leather. But if it's a thinner leather, a calf skin that's been calendared, pared extremely thin, it is usually best to lift some of the board along with the leather. Otherwise, you can cause cracking to the leather. It can also just disintegrate as you try to lift it, because it may be that the leather doesn't have any structural strength left. And if you try to lift it by itself, it'll just crumble. Lifting paper is primarily end sheets for hinge repairs, or, as previously mentioned, case bindings for board attachment. And then parchment, I will not actually be demoing lifting parchment today, but I really find that parchment falls into one of the two categories already mentioned. If the parchment on a binding is unlined, it really lifts very similarly to leather. Whereas if the parchment has been lined with paper before being used for a binding, it lifts similar to paper. And you have to be careful when you are lifting a lined piece of parchment, because you can cut through that lining paper without cutting through the parchment, but that will still be visible on the outside of the binding. So now we'll jump into discussing our tools for lifting. So first off, sharpness is the key to success with lifting. Board, bookboard, millboard, pasteboard, any type of board you're lifting with, it will dull blades extremely quickly. And it dulls them by creating a burr on the blade. And a burr is where that very fine point on the edge of your knife will curl back on itself. And that dulls the blade, but also it creates an edge that will just push the board in front of it, causing it to roll up under the covering material, leaving a bump that can be hard to remove. So you always want to have a sharp blade. One way to help ensure that is to use a strop. This is a homemade strop I have with 2 pieces of leather, one on each side, and on this side that's more green, that has a stropping compound worked into it. And routine sharpening of your tools for lifting is a must. I would say, depending on usage, it's anywhere between once a month and once every 2 months that I sharpen my own knives. And sharpening in and of itself could be its own talk and demonstration. And so I'm not going to delve too far into how to keep your knives sharp here, but I am happy to take questions about sharpening at the end. And for sharpening, things like whetstones, diamond stones, or adhesive-backed abrasive films stuck to a flat surface all work well to resharpen a blade. So looking at our first tools, we're going to be looking at micro spatulas, specifically carbon steel micro spatulas. Caselli's are a popular brand, but you might have other ones from another maker. And these work well because the carbon steel allows you to sharpen them like you would a knife. I don't use mine for lifting, so they're not sharp. For people that do, what you do is use a belt sander or sandpaper to create a bevel on one edge. It's a chisel cut bevel, and that means the bevel is only on one side with one flat reference side. And once you have that bevel and have it sharp, these can work well for lifting or backing removal. And I find that spatulas aren't my preferred lifting tool because you are set to whatever curve the tool has. Whether it's a thinner, shallower one or a larger oval one like this, you're stuck with that curve. And additionally, they do have a level of flexibility to them, which can be helpful when you're lifting spine material where it's on a curve. But when you're lifting on a flat surface, that can cause the blade to wander some on your board, and you may not get a straight line for your lift. For scalpels, many people that I know that like to lift with scalpels prefer a curved blade. So on a number 3 or a number 7 handle, which is what's in the picture here, you can go with a number 10 blade. For a number 4 handle, there are a number of curved blades. This is a number 4 handle with a blade number 20 on it, but you can do 20 through 24, all curved blades. The nice thing about scalpels is they are always sharp, and you never have to worry about resharpening them. You just get a new blade. That said, they do have a double bevel, and the double bevel can lead to wandering as you're making a cut. The flexibility has the same help and hindrances as it does with the carbon steel spatulas. And then one other place that can be concerning is where the blade attaches to the handle. That little nub can limit how deep into a board you can lift unless you are really kind of cranking up that lifted material, which you have to be careful of because that can cause a crease on the board that will still be visible once you put the covering material back down. Next up, you can use a bench knife. The one I have in the picture here and in my hand, this is the style that I have on hand. Other people may have a clip point knife, or also known as a shoe knife. These can work well for lifting. You again have to keep them very sharp. And I think they are better suited for board slitting, where you're trying to split the board in half. Part of that has to do with their cross section. These blades typically have a triangular cross section, so they're kind of a wedge as you put them into the board, but they can be used effectively for any type of lifting. And then the last tool that we'll be looking at today are lifting knives. And these two you see in the picture and that I have here in my hand, these are lifting knives I have made myself. They are based off of the design that Jeff Peachy manufactures and sells, and that design is in turn based off of knives developed by Roger Powell in the mid-20th century. These knives have a chisel cut bevel, so they have a bevel only on one surface of the blade. The back is flat, and that allows you to have a good surface to register on, to get a straight cut all the way across the board. Your only limitation on the depth of cut is how far you can insert the knife and still get a cutting action, which can be helpful at times. And I have made my own. Many paring knives will be made with a bevel between 13 and 15 degrees for paring leather, and sometimes lifting knives are done at a similar bevel. I have found through trial and error that I prefer a 20-degree bevel on my lifting knives, and that it still is shallow enough to allow me to do very delicate lifts, but the blade is a little more robust to stand up to the beating that bookboard can provide. Now, lifting knives are specialized one-trick ponies, and they can be expensive. So what it comes down to is that the best tool is the one you're most comfortable with. For me, that's lifting knives. I've made and shaped my own, so I really know how they work and how they handle. But whatever tool you like to use best will be the best tool to use. Now, probably the most important section is lifting safety. As we already discussed, your blade should be razor sharp, and the most dangerous knife is actually a dull knife. This is similar to kitchen knives, whereas if you're cutting with a dull knife, you're using more force and you're more likely to slip. If you're more likely to slip, you are more likely to cut yourself. So that's part of the reason you always want to have a sharp knife, so you can use as little force as possible when making these cuts. And related to that is where you put your hands related to the board, because obviously it's similar rules to using a chisel. You never want to be having the blade come at your hand. If you have the board here and your hand is resting on top of it, when you bring a blade into it, if that blade slips and goes out of the covering material, it's right into your hand. And so one way to protect against that is, instead of weighting the board with your hand, is you can weight it with a weight, in this case a brick that you can set on top. Therefore, if you slip and come through the covering material, it hits the brick, not your hand. And you can put your hand on to apply more pressure. That said, rules like this tend to be meant to be bent, and there are instances in lifting where you may need to have your hand in a slightly precarious position. During the demo, I will show ways to safely do that. So with ways to lift the material, sometimes the board and the material will determine that for you. Generally, that comes down to, where is the adhesion stronger? Is it between the covering material and the board, or between the board and itself below the covering material? Because if the internal adhesion of the board is stronger, you're probably going to be able to get the covering material off on its own with no problem. But if that adhesion between the covering material and the top layer of board is stronger than the internal adhesion of the board, you're definitely going to need to take some of the board with that material. So the first way to lift is just the material. This is the most challenging type of lift due to the risk of slicing through the covering material, as we've discussed previously in the safety section. But it sometimes is the preferred way for the type of repair you're doing. Next is to do a thin piece of board with the covering material. Thin in this instance, I'm estimating to be between 0.1 and 0.3 millimeters. I haven't measured it, but by my eye, that's about what it looks like. And that's a thin enough piece of board to support the covering material. It makes it less likely you're going to cut through, and it can also provide a better gluing surface potentially for putting it back down, because that surface is a little more uniform than the bottom of cloth or leather. The last way is to take a thick cut of the board plus the covering material, and thick in this instance means generally about 1 millimeter. And this technique does blur the line between lifting and board slitting. It's generally, that line is dependent on how thick the board is. If you're taking a 1 millimeter cut of the board, but that's half the board thickness, you're doing something that blurs between lifting and splitting. However, if it's a 3 millimeter board or a double thickness of board that's 6 millimeters and you're only lifting a millimeter, that's still a lift rather than board slitting. And this again is something that is usually done on an angle in order to not have to do a secondary lift to cover that little edge of board that can be exposed there. So we're going to move on to talk about lifting technique before I start doing the demonstration. I mentioned this in the handout, but in Bernard Middleton's The Restoration of Leather Bindings, page 128 to 134 in the 4th edition of that book, it's a fantastic resource for how to lift. Middleton is also a proponent of lifting knives, and he has a very good succinct description of lifting technique in those pages. So the first thing to know is you want to slice and not push. And what that means is, if you take your knife and you try to just push it into the board to the depth of your lift, and at best will roll the board up under the covering material, and more likely you'll blow through the covering material. And so the way that you want to lift is you want to slice along the length of the board so that you are cutting through the board or cutting through that adhesion between the covering material and the board. And so when I'm lifting, I will do multiple shallow passes. I usually start with a pass that is anywhere, and it's a pass to establish my line, to make sure that I'm not wandering, either going from one end of the board low to high or the opposite, high to low. I want it straight across. And so to establish that line, I'm going in, depending on the board, between 1/8 of an inch and 1/4 of an inch, or 3 to 6 millimeters. And then once I have that established, my subsequent passes will be 1/4 of an inch to 3/8 of an inch, 6 to 9 millimeters deep, depending on the board. You ideally want to keep a slight downward angle with your blade, so you have the back of the blade or tool higher than the front, so that when you are cutting in, it's not a risk to blow out the covering material. And if you do drop that down so the back of the tool is lower, you will most likely come through the covering material. And lastly, I prefer to lift from a clean edge. And what that means is, on a book board, there will always be that bit of paste down that is on the inside edge of the board. And that obscures your view of the board. It obscures exactly how thick the board is, minus the covering material and minus the paste down. And so what I find is it's best to just remove that material before you start lifting. It is possible to lift that material, but in my experience, most of the time, if you try to lift that, that paper on the edge of the board, is that it will either be very well adhered, and so it will want to tear and crack and break in pieces, and that if you do manage to get it free, because it has that hard 90-degree angle at the edge of the board, it will just split there and fall off anyways. So I don't worry about it. Additionally, if I'm doing this type of work, I'm going to be putting down a Japanese paper hinge on the inside, and adding that plus the bulk of this paper there can change the mechanics of the book. So I find it better to lift from a clean edge, more similar to this one. At this point, Andrew, if we can transition over to the other camera and get started there, we'll start the demonstration. Okay, so to start with, we will go back to that board I was showing you that has the edge still with material there. And so to start with, I will always remove this material. And so the way I do that is with Alpha or Scalpel, whatever is your preferred tool. And I will tend to start with leather, with this leather edge here that you can see extending over. If I try to cut through that with it in the air, so with the board like this, that will probably break because, and it won't have a clean edge. So what I'll do is I'll start with the board inside up and just find that board edge with my knife. And part of this is that I am keeping the edge of my blade here below the top of the board so that I don't risk kind of wandering off into the board as I cut. And I'm not too worried about getting the end sheet right now. I am mainly worried about getting the leather to have a nice edge. So if I flip this over, you can see that now that leather edge is much nicer. So now I can follow that edge I have established to remove the end sheet. And I'm putting pressure near where I'm cutting so that the paper doesn't bunch up as much and will leave a nice clean edge. So with that done, a little bit hanging on. So with that done, there's still a little bit of paper remnants there, and usually I would go back and remove that so I can see the edge of the board, but I have a sense of where the thickness of the board is now. And so now I'll transition over to a clean board. So this edge, this is usually the level to which I would clean that edge. And so this is, we'll start with lifting cloth. Cloth lifting can depend on many things. On this board in particular, I can see that there are bubbles where the adhesion has failed. So I think this is probably a good candidate for trying to lift just the cloth. And so normally when I lift, I will work in this orientation with the book or the board on the edge of my bench so that I can work and I can have the knife down here off the edge to lift, but that doesn't work very well on video. So I'll instead lift at an angle like this so that you all can see it. And first, before I start lifting this top edge, we're going to talk about what to do with our turn-ins. So the strategy that I like, I found in a Guild Bookworkers video by Dominic Riley. It was a video he did in 2009 for the Guild at a presentation. And in it, when he talks about lifting material, the way that he lifts these areas so as to not lose them is he will take a knife and cut right along the line of the paper and the cloth to separate that. I'll do that on both sides. And usually on a book that I'm working on, I want these to be very even. And so I will use a pair of dividers to set that depth. For this for demonstration purposes, I don't feel the need to go quite that far. And then I'll just see with my blade, make sure so I didn't quite cut through the cloth there. So we'll run it again. And then once it's through, I can lift just this very tiny bit of the turn-in. And then when I get to the depth that I want, I can either cut it, or for cloth, what can work nicely, I can either cut through it, and then on the very edge, with leather you have to cut the edge as well. It won't operate, it won't work well otherwise. But with cloth, you can tear that edge right there to lift it. And when that edge, sorry, let me get that in screen. When that edge is torn, when you go to put that back down, the frayed edge kind of lines up and helps make that a little less visible. So I will lift the other side as well. And then make that cut. And there's the tear. So once that's done and these flaps are up, that will allow the edges of the cloth to separate from the boards as I lift it. So to start my lift, I will come in, I'm left-handed, so I tend to work left to right rather than right to left. That may be different for you. I will come in and I am getting just under the cloth layer. And so then once I'm under there, trying not to pick up the board. And I'm actually going to switch to the larger knife. So you can see how I'm just going in a little bit just to establish the material coming up off the board. And this one is, I can feel the cloth is releasing very well. So this is a pretty easy lift. One place of note on cloth bindings is anywhere there is tooling, whether it's blind or with gold or foil, that part of the cloth will always be stuck to the board better than the rest of the cloth. And so you have to be careful in those areas to lift that area. So now that I've got my initial depth of cut, I will come back up to the top, and I'm here, I'm working under the tooling there. And so I'm really pushing my knife, the tip of my knife, down into the board to make sure that I'm below the tooling there. And then I can be a little more relaxed in here, just trying to keep it flat on the board, using the board as a reference surface. Again, there's more tooling down here that I need to be aware of. So now I will come back and make another pass. And I can see, I don't know, let's see if I can show this on camera. It's very small. So there is right there, you can see a little shininess. That is a spot where the cloth didn't release, and so it tore through, but it's just a little pinprick hole, and that's not a concern, as any new covering material would be toned to match, and so it wouldn't be visible. So I'll just keep coming down. When I get to the tooling down here at the bottom, again, forcing down into the board to make sure that I'm below it. And this is very important when you're just lifting the covering material. So now I can come back. Yep, and that's what happened. I thought I had it released and I didn't, and I split through the covering material right at the bottom of that crown, unfortunately. So now I'll come back in from the other side and go a little slower. And that gives me, let's see, so that gives me a release of, for the most part, just the covering material, a little bit of board here and there. That's almost inevitable. It's impossible not to lift some of the board. And so that would be lifting cloth on a detached board. The next one we'll look at is how we lift cloth when the case is still intact. And so to do this, I will put the board that I'm going to lift on down, paste down, side down on my surface. Then I will put a weight that is about weight or other small boards just to make up the height of the spine so that I can then lay the other board over the top. And what this gives me is access down along here. And I realize it's not the most visible, and this is a challenging lift, even though there's no tooling on these boards, because it is a blind lift. And so here I am trying to take a bit of the board with the covering material. So I don't tend to start at the edge on a lift like this, because usually along the edge there will be a place where you can see a little bit more of the board than others. And so as I work down this edge here in the middle, it's already released from the board a little bit, so I can see my starting point. So that's where I'll go to insert my knife. And from there, I can see the edge of the board that I'm lifting and make sure that I'm getting part of the board. And these initial parts tend to be pretty slow because you are wanting to make sure you stay on your line. The board does not always delaminate in a straight line. And so now we'll come back down and work to the other side. And on these, when the case is still connected, you're not going all the way through the top because you don't want to be cutting through that joint. So any repair you're going to do will need to be less than the height of the book. And it's really a feel for whether or not you are still below the cloth or if you've gone through the cloth. If you're still below the cloth and the covering material, you'll feel a pressure on the top of your knife. And that's what lets you know that you're still there. So now that I've made that initial cut, I can come back in and can work my blade deeper. And this one is also, there's no tooling on this cloth, so it releases pretty easily. So if I open this back up so you can see that board. So my knife is now in here. So my knife is now stuck in. Let's see, you can see that bump there in the middle. That is where my knife is, so I've lifted that far in. And that should give you plenty of room to make to insert usually Japanese paper to reinforce these joints and to reinforce the case. And so I now want to jump, I'm going to pull the other board back in. So I talked about how there are places when you're lifting, with it on the side like this, you can use a weight to protect your hand from the blade. I, as I'm sure you've seen in the video, have been using my hand. And part of that is when I have the board on the edge of the table rather than in the middle, what I will do is I hold my knife very close to the top and I will put this lower finger against the edge of the table. And I'll work the blade kind of sideways like that along the edge of the table. And what that means is that there's no risk of, if my hand is back here, there's no risk of the blade getting to my hand because I'm not letting the blade go any further than that small amount there on the edge. So that's a safe way to brace the board with your hand. Additionally, when you're making these small shallow passes in here, you're using so little pressure, and most of that pressure is applied to the side, that you shouldn't have a risk of jamming through and cutting up towards your hand. So now I'm going to move to, so I have another cloth board here that I need to trim the edge down on. So let me do that really quick. So again, for trimming the edge, you're just finding the edge of the board and following it with your knife and cutting through any of the material that is hanging off the edge. And then once you have a clean edge, the reason I wanted to show this board is it has these two blind tooled lines here and here that run the length of the board. Blind tooling, similar to gold tooling, can stick worse, so you have to be careful of that when lifting. But the other nice thing it provides is if you are to lift to the end of this blind line, let's say that's how far you're going to lift into the board, you can use that edge because that can help hide the bump from the new material as a way to disguise that. And so on this one, I think instead of just lifting the covering material, which you could do, it's a cloth that it just, the more you work with these, the more you get a sense of which cloths and which leathers you can lift without board, which ones you can lift with board. For this one, I'm going to show this with the bench knife. And so I'm actually going to split this, do a thicker lift with the bench knife. And so I will have to angle this slightly differently just to get started. So lifting with a bench knife, the biggest concern is that as you're cutting that wedge of the knife, as you can see there how much thicker the back of the knife is than the edge. And so that wedge will kind of force the board open. And so that's just something to be aware of. The double bevel can also cause it to wander. And so this is a case where I'm going to need to prop this up slightly. This is a case where as you're cutting down, you want to be sure that double bevel isn't wandering like that and pokes through the covering, the point pokes through the covering material. So this is an option. It is not, as I have said, my preferred way to lift, but it is an option. I would prefer to come in with a lifting knife to the depth that I want and just pull my blade through the board. And I can tell this board is a thicker board than the last one I lifted. It has a lot more, it takes a lot more force to cut into it. And so this is where you just want to use small, shallow cuts coming this way. And you can even, if you have a curve on your knife like this one, you can roll that cut for lifting that material. And so, so that is kind of how to do a deeper lift there. We'll now look at a couple of leather boards. We'll start with the easiest of those, which is a board like this. These larger boards, thicker, this is a double layer board here. The leather, which you can see here, is pretty thick. So this is a good candidate to lift just the leather. So the turn-ins you would do the same way of cutting on the inside here and cutting around to the edge to the depth you want. And then for lifting that material, you come in. Sorry, it's hard. I have to keep my eyes a little further back than I would because of the camera in the way. So coming right underneath the material. And again, I'm cutting in this direction. So my hand's back here, which is safe because I'm not cutting in that direction. I wouldn't want to put my hand here and cut. And so this leather, again, leather tooling on leather will also hold it in place better. So my initial cut, I'm going to this blind line there on the edge. So that's my initial lift. So now I have my line. Let me get the entire thing in the view. So I have my line now established straight across the board, not going up, not going down, which is really useful for when you go to put in repair material. So if we're going deeper, it's the same, cutting downward. Let me see if I can position this so that you can see the angle on the knife. So if my knife tip is in there, I have the blade coming up at an angle like that as I cut deeper in, because I don't want to risk blowing through the material. If I were, I'll demo it down here. So here I got the downward angle so that I can keep cutting down into the board and not come through the covering material. But if I drop that angle, so, come at it at this angle, yeah, in that case, it split along the edge and popped the leather up. But usually that will cause you to break through the surface. And so again, lifting this is now, I can feel that I've got a pretty good grip. I just have to be careful around the tooling. Also have to be careful at this point right here, that is the remnants of the original cord sewing support. Those can be tricky areas to lift because as you come into those, the density of that cord is different from the board that you're cutting through. So it can either be easier or harder to cut through. If it's easier, as you come to it, you're cutting along, you'll hit it and your blade can jump forward, which isn't what you want. But if it's harder, you can start pushing harder and harder. And then when it does finally give, you can cut through the covering material. So you just want to go slow. I will make a lot of shallow cuts, again, using a sweeping motion with the blade until I've cut through that cord. And there on the edge of the knife, see if I can get that to focus on it. You can see a little bit of the cord that came out. And so once that's cut through, you can continue the lift, being careful around the tooling until you get further down, and then can come back and open it up to the full depth that you want. And so again, you can see that is just a minimal amount of the board, mostly just the leather coming up. Now, our next leather, we're kind of moving up in difficulty. So a smaller format board, a thinner leather, that also feels much better adhered to the board than the previous one. And so on this one, again, we'll bring the block in to get it up a little bit. So for the starting cut, I want to be sure to take a little bit of the material with me. And so this very corner, the leather is actually lost on, that's board. And so I will actually try to lift, I'll remove that later so it's not over the top of my new material. But for the lifting purposes, I do want to keep that, because that helps me establish my line. So now I've lifted underneath that little bit of board in the corner. I can then bring the knife around the other direction and can cut, keeping that line so that I've got just a bit of board. I don't want to dive too deep, but I also don't want to be right underneath the leather, because this leather, I can tell from the grain loss here and how it's degraded that it would probably start to crumble if I were just underneath the leather. Leather, also you have to go slow when lifting because of that fact. If you lift too much leather at once, the grain can break on you if it is degraded enough. So this initial cut is always going to be your slowest and where you want to spend most of your focus and time to make sure you're getting started exactly where you want. So once that's done all the way down, I'll move the block now. You can come back in, find your cut again, and work kind of sweeping motions back and forth to deepen that cut. And again, working with the back of the blade up, or the back of the tool up, so that you're driving into the board so that you don't risk blowing through. And what that would look like here, if I were to blow through, would be I'd come at an upward angle and something like that, where, so now that piece has been cut through. Or it can happen where you're pushing and you can do things like that. The board can roll up on you, in which case that means you're digging too far in like this, and there's that cut. My tools I did resharpen yesterday, which is why I'm getting clean cuts through instead of having the board roll in front of the knife. But that is how you would mess up that type of lift, by pushing your knife into the board rather than cutting along the board, and sweeping motions back and forth to get through tricky areas. So now what I find to be the most difficult leather to lift is when you get to these types. So these are most likely calf, could be sheep. It just depends. And With these, on this one, you can see here along the edge, the grain is lost all along here. It's heavily abraded further in. It's lost down here again. There's signs of red rot starting. And so this is going to be a very fragile board to lift. This one as well, while it has less visible signs of damage, I can tell from when I trimmed this edge clean. There are areas, let me get them in view. So right in here, you can see a little bit, sorry, try to get that to center. There's a little bit of roughness here on the edge, and that was from cutting it flush, and it kind of pulled at the leather. So I know on things this thin, you definitely want to be taking a good portion of the board with the leather just to support it, because the leather alone will probably crumble because it doesn't have any structural strength remaining. So again, pushing into the board. And I'm staying, for this initial lift on this board, I'm staying shy of that tooling line because that will be a harder area to lift through. And here I can feel sewing support. So again, just small rocking motions until I cut through it. And then continuing along down the board. And so then I'll just start back up here for the demonstration purposes. Once you have that initial started, you can come in, and I really do like a kind of sweeping motion to get under lines like this, especially if the leather is fragile. If you're just trying to push it straight, you risk popping the tooling up off the leather. So kind of these very shallow sweeping cuts to get me further in to the board. And for depth of cut for lift, it depends on the size. I will do more depth on the lift the larger the book is. But even with a book like for this size, which is about 8 inches tall, I would prefer to have probably lifting an inch of depth in to put a repair in that's going to be so an inch, 2.5, probably 25 millimeters, and then probably for a repair that's about a half to 3/4 inch. So, sorry, doing conversions in my head. That's about 12 to 18 millimeters as a way. So there, I've lifted to that depth, which would allow me to do a shorter repair. And you can see there, just trying to lift that edge because this edge is still secured, it caused this leather to split. So you want to be careful with this degraded leather. You want to be sure that you're taking some board. And as you can see, I started to on the edge, and my knife did follow the grain of the leather up. Is this working? Can you still see me? Okay, I think I'm back. As I cut through this, the knife followed the grain of the leather up, and that can happen, and it's something to be aware of as you're lifting deeper. So now we'll go ahead and flip this over and look at lifting the paste down. So for lifting paste downs, you do want to take some board with the paper. The paper's so thin that it's easy to cut through. So it's a very similar start where you're getting a little bit of board right on the edge. Paste downs can be more tricky. It's more likely to roll material up underneath them. But if you can get in there, I'm hitting a sewing support again. So again, want to just be careful moving through that. I may even come to the other side and just keep moving, and I'll come back to that area. So I can push back into my cut line here, which is helpful. And then I can keep coming down the board. Oops. Sorry, I need to shift this to the edge. I realize that view is not very helpful. It's just easier for me to see it to know that I'm following my line. All right. So that gives me my initial cut there. Now I can come back. I can deepen that, again, being careful where I ran into those sewing supports before. Again, kind of a back and forth sawing motion to work my way through those. And so that will give me enough depth now to where I can lift that up, and you can see how much board there is still on the bottom there. And it's pretty stiff, but that gives me enough room to slip a small repair under there. And there's not enough of a visible edge of the board here along the edge that you would not be able to, that you would have to do a secondary covering to cover it. It will just blend in once you put the repair in. So that brings us to the end of the demonstration. I'm going to switch back to the other camera so I can take questions.
All right. I'm going to read to you from our list of questions here. First one is from Hans, who would like to see your technique for using the dividers to set the cut depth that you referred to just prior to beginning to lift.
Yes, so I can do this here where you can see me. So what I'll do is measure out my dividers. In this case, I'll get them set to 1 inch or roughly 25 millimeters. So if I have my board here, I will take the dividers and I can use the tips, one lined up to the edge and one lined up on the board. And I'll use the tip to make a small mark that I'm sure you cannot see because it is very tiny, but I made a small mark with the divider where that is on the edge. And then on that edge, I'll take my lifting knife and put it on that mark and make a vertical cut into the board. And so that's how I will mark. Let me see if that is visible right there. That is where I'll make my mark using the dividers. And I'll use the dividers so that I know that my marks on one end from the corner of the board to the other are the same. That can be slightly complicated when there is back cornering, like this board is back cornered. And so in that case, what you can do is on a cutting mat, you can get your board edge lined up on a cutting mat on an individual line like that. And then you can just measure over to the line to make, you can just use that line or use a set of dividers from that line instead of from the edge of the board.
Great, thanks, Noah. Our next question is, what did you use as the base for making the larger lifting knife in the image you shared?
Yes, so the larger lifting knife, this is made out of, this is 1 inch wide, 1/16 of an inch thick A2 tool steel. And so any sort of high carbon steel is going to work. O1 is another tool steel that you can use. 1095, 1084, those are steels that will work. The benefits of A2, Jeff Peachy has a very good blog post where he lays that out for. It is similar, let me think how to put this, similar toughness for re-sharpening to O1, but it's the durability of the blade lasts quite a bit longer. So that's why I use that to make this knife.
Great. From Christina, is there a problem to lift just a little bit of the board, like 5 millimeters to 10 millimeters?
So to just lift a very small amount at the edge, I think that's what that means. You can do that. I find doing a deeper lift is helpful to me because I may only want to put in a 5 millimeter or 10 millimeter wide repair into the board, but I probably want to lift twice that depth just so that it's a little bit easier to get the repair material in, to get adhesive in. And once you have glued everything back down, whether you lifted to 10 millimeters or 20 millimeters, it's usually not too visible.
Okay. From Rachel, are there any resources or videos for adding and toning the Japanese cloth hinge after the cover is lifted?
That is a good question. I am trying to think. Off the top of my head, I am not thinking of videos I've seen doing that. That's one I'd have to do a little bit of looking to see. I'm not sure off the top of my head.
Okay, that can maybe be addressed in the continuing conversation on the site later. Next, we have from Debbie, can you buy lifting knives that have millimeters notched on the side to aid in knowing how far to push it under the cloth covering? Or is that not helpful?
Oh, that is a good question. I have not seen knives that have that benefit. Part of that is due to a lot of this style lifting knife. There is a bevel on the side as well, so it would be hard to have notches along there. Part of that can be another way to do that, to see how deep you're going, can be to, with a ruler on top of the board, you can take a ruler and, measure in. So like to the edge of this tooling line, I can see that that is 6 millimeters. So I can use that as a reference point for how deep I'm going into the board. And I can pick other spots along the board and measure to them as a reference point, is one way to do it.
Excellent, thank you. Next we have from Christina, would you ever dampen slightly the cloth or cover material the cloth cover material to aid in the lifting off technique?
I do not dampen the material. I try not to introduce too much moisture, especially certain cloths, because they're typically a starch-filled cloth. If you're dampening part of it but not all of it, you can leave a tide line very easily. And so I try not to introduce too much moisture until I'm adhering it back down. And you could also have pigment bleed depending on the cloth. You'd have to test your cloth for water solubility before dampening it. But I don't know that it would be helpful, because the cloth as it is a little bit stiff, which helps it kind of lift away. Whereas I would worry if it were wet, it could bunch up instead. So that would be my concern there.
Makes sense. From James, is it ever preferred to lift a pulling up motion rather than to cut?
So you can use a pulling up motion rather than a slicing motion. Usually, I may do that even a little bit. Let me grab, so like on this first cloth board we did, where I lifted that up, I might go back when I'm trying to get a repair in there, because even with this lifted, there's still not a ton of space that I can see in there. And so I might go in with my knife to the end of my cut, so about an inch, 20, 25 millimeters in there, and I might lift a little bit that way. But if I'm flexing the material, I'm not putting any pressure forward, because I don't want to cut through it. Additionally, you don't want to go too far, because like if I take this and really crank it up, aside from it cracking there, if you go too far with it, you'll get a crease line that will still be visible. There when you put the cloth back down.
Great. From Sarah, do you ever trim 1 millimeter or so of covering material from the top of the board before lifting, or do you prefer the material be flush with the board?
That depends. I will sometimes trim the material back. It depends on if there's tooling present and how close it is to the edge. It can also depend on how I'm going to be doing the reback and whether or not I want a flush edge, or I think that will look better. It's really, I don't think one way is better than the other. There's just different options for different opportunities.
Great. If you have a cloth-bound book that the material is also frayed or gone on all of the other edges, would you lift and put toned paper under?
Yes.
Okay.
That is something I've done. I will lift and put toned paper under. If it's lost on all the edges, then instead of how I talked about, like on this board with cutting along the paste down, I won't do that. If it's missing the edge entirely, I'll just lift from that missing edge underneath the cloth and the paste down.
Great. From Janice, did you say that you do or do not face the leather when it is very fragile? If you do, what do you use?
Yes, I did not talk about facing leather. If it is very fragile, I will face it. I don't find it that often that I'm facing leather on boards. It's more commonly the spine that I'll face. And when I am facing that, I will use a lens tissue, a 10 GSM, machine-made Japanese paper, 15 GSM, somewhere in that range of paper. And I use Closel G, hydroxypropyl cellulose in isopropanol. And usually I'll use a very thin, like a 1.5–2% solution to do my facing with that. And that will adhere it to the surface and provide support. And then to remove it, isopropanol works to remove that.
Great, thanks. Another one is, if a book cover is too damaged to repair, what are the solutions for a new cover? Would you be able to mimic the original materials properly if you had to redo the cover completely?
So that it can depend on a lot of things. A lot of that can come down to decoration on the board. You can definitely, well, you can, especially with cloth, it's hard to recreate a lot of the 19th century cloths exactly. And so it's hard to get those patterns right. So it will look different. You can get the color close, but it can be hard to match the patterning. And to do that, to match you tone it with the color, you could then lay the cloth out and impregnate it with paste and let that dry. That's kind of like the starch filling on a book cloth. But that's more challenging. Cloth is hard to make it look the same. Leather, you can have a better shot at it by using either dyeing your own leather or using a pre-dyed leather that's the right color that looks correct to recreate the board. The problem can be the tooling, because you may not have the tools on hand to recreate what's there. So maybe you do a blind version of it, do a panel if that's close. That can be the hard part to replicate. So it's not so much the covering material that's hard, it can be the decoration that's difficult.
Thanks. Lindsay is asking, do you ever use Closel G or other stabilizing technique prior to lifting to counteract the impact of red rot or other degradation on leather covers?
Yes, if this had not been doing a demonstration like a board like this one, where I can really see how much red rot there is there along the edges, I would use something like Closel G as a consolidant around the edges, just to hold that, to try and prevent that from powdering more, as well as keep it from becoming friable as I applied the pressure to lift it.
She also asked, where did you get your apron?
So this apron is from Artifact Bag Company out of Omaha, Nebraska.
Great. Next, we have Janice. Do you ever use ethanol plus methyl cellulose to lift the paste down area?
I have not. For most of my lifting, I tend to stick with mechanical lifting, just out of fear of creating potential tide lines. And so I tend to stick to mechanical lifting rather than using a solvent, whether it be water or ethanol, to try and hydrate an area to aid with the lifting.
Got it. Christiana says, if the cords are broken, do you leave them there or cut them off?
So if the cords are broken, I tend to cut them off, mainly because they get in the way of doing, of putting in, if I'm going to be reattaching a board with like a cotton spine lining, they'll get in the way of that and will cause a lump. And it can be that you'll stick down that cloth and it'll be on top of the cord fragment, but then there's no adhesive underneath that cord fragment. And so you have a place that is not actually adhered to the board. So I tend to cut those off and remove them.
Okay. Rachel asks, is there a reason you would lift the paste side versus the other side? Is it for the preservation of the Closel material?
So is that,
Sorry.
Exactly. Is that asking about lifting the paste down versus the other end sheet, or I'm not sure.
I'm not sure. Maybe she can, Rachel, you can clarify, resubmit a question and we'll come back to it. Sarah White is asking, do you always lift the end sheet as well? Or if not, in what situation would you do both?
So I would say more often than not, I lift both because I know that I'm going to be doing a hinge repair when I get the book back together anyways. So if I'm already in there and lifting one side, it makes sense to me to lift the other to have that repair just look a little bit neater on the inside instead of having the Japanese paper edge on top of the paste down as well as the flyleaf.
Great, thanks. Judy asks, regarding workflow, would you lift several covers and then proceed to repair, or would you lift then repair each book?
So that can depend on a number of things. I actually have a situation like that right now. I've got a set of small leather books I'm working on. And the way I'm approaching those is I'm going to be lifting them all first and then doing the, like getting them reattached to the book and then proceeding with the reback. The place where you may want to do it as a one-off is once that edge is lifted, it's much more fragile, obviously, than if it was still attached to the board. And so if you're going to lift it, but then it might be several weeks before you get back to doing the next step, I would probably wait and lift it when you need to do the next step instead of having it floating around a workshop, maybe getting moved from table to table or shelf to shelf with that either leather or cloth loose there, because you don't want to accidentally break that off.
Good, thanks. We've got, what is your favorite sharpening compound from Ashley?
So for sharpening, I really like the adhesive-backed abrasive films that you can get. I know Rio Grande sells them. You can get them from like Lee Valley Tools. And it's a sheet of Mylar that is essentially sandpaper. But the nice part about that is you can wet sand on them. And because it has that adhesive back, you can stick it to even just like a flat piece of MDF. You can stick it to that and use it until, it's no longer sharp, peel it off and put another one down.
Okay, Janice asks, when you add repair material, do you cut a recess in the board so the new material does not create a ridge line visible under the old?
So usually, like on a cloth binding, I'm usually lifting at a slight downward angle anyways, and that can help to prevent a line showing up. Additionally, with a cloth binding, you can press it and put a lot more pressure on it than you can with leather. That can help minimize that appearance. On a leather binding, usually I try to pare the edge of the leather thin enough that there's not going to be a noticeable bump there. It's just kind of from the very tip of the leather that's underneath on the board to the edge of the board. It's a gradual increase in thickness that hopefully isn't noticeable.
Great. Ellen is asking, can you show us a completed repair?
Do I have one in shop at the moment is the question. The last one went out the door earlier this week and the others are in progress. So I don't have a completed one to show. I'm sorry.
Okay. Let's see, moving down the list. Let's see, Audra asks, would you ever remove board material to accommodate the new spine or hinge material to avoid there being a visible bump when the repair is complete?
That is an option. I tend to try to use other tricks to reduce that that visual, hiding it right along a tooling line or something like that, or paring it thin or putting it in the press, just because removing board works for that time that you're repairing it. But if it needs to be repaired again in the future, that board's not there for them to use. So I try not to do that, but sometimes that can be the best way to hide the repair.
Great. We had another question, similar question. For leather boards, it looks like you're not cutting in at a bevel and leaving a bit of a hump per Middleton. Is there a reason for that?
So I find that, Middleton does leave a bump and usually will leave part of the original material or will go back and replace original material that he removes. I personally find that a lot of the time when I'm reattaching boards, I'm using cloth rather than lacing cords in or something like that. And so to leave a bump like that would be in the way of that attachment. And so I would have to remove it and put another piece back in. So I don't tend to do that. I also find that if I want to hide that edge of the leather, because obviously that's why you do it, so that you can hide the old edge into the new edge and kind of have it be flush. Another way to do that is when you do your reback and you put the leather on the book, you can put a layer of Mylar or like the polyethylene deli sheeting in between the new leather and the old leather so that there's a moisture barrier. And then you can put it in a nipping press quickly to kind of press that the old leather into the new leather. So when it dries, there's kind of a recess for it to fall into, and then they'll still be even.
Wonderful. Debbie asks, she says she'd love to see a follow-up presentation on attaching the hinge. She's curious as to how the hinge is attached to the spine. Does that need to be lifted too?
Yes. So this was specifically about lifting on boards, but yes, in this instance, I'm assuming either the spine is already off or has been lifted off.
Okay. Let's see. What material do you use to line a damaged spine that is still attached to the covers? From Margot.
So I will use Japanese paper to do that lining. Like for a case where it's still connected. It's a nice and thin material and typically doesn't create a lump on the board when you put that in. Usually for that, I'll go, it can depend on the cloth thickness and things, but anywhere from, I would say probably like a 20 GSM to maybe up to a 60 GSM, depending on the size of the book for the weight of the paper. And then whether or not I tone that paper will depend on when I look at the joints with transmitted light behind them. If I can see through the joints in places, I will go ahead and at least tone that paper so that you're not going to see the kind of natural color of the paper through those holes in the spine cloth.
Excellent. Sarah asks, do you feel that the way the adhesive is applied to attach the reback to the boards can exacerbate any ridge lines? If so, any tips? It sounds like you've already.
Yeah, I don't, for adhesive, I think that you're adding in dampness and with that, you can usually manipulate the boards a bit to hide a ridge line by using a press and things like that. I do, when I reattach stuff, I will typically on the board itself, I'll put down a very thin layer of paste, regardless of if I'm using paste or PVA to put the new material in. And the reason I do that is because the board is so dry that if I try to do the repair without having that layer of adhesive there, the adhesive on my new piece of material will just get sucked into the board before I can really get it in position how I want it. So I'll do a thin layer of paste just to kind of dampen the board so that I have time to move my repair around.
All right. And Anne asks, are you toning with acrylics, watercolors, or inks?
So I most commonly tone with acrylics. I use golden fluid acrylics. I will sometimes use watercolors, but those watercolors I tend to use more for paper repairs. I find that the acrylics, especially if I'm trying to match for cloth, there's an opacity that they give to the paper that works well to mimic cloth.
Right. And we have James asking to repeat the resource on the technique for cutting the turn-ins from the Guild of Bookworkers.
That was a video featuring Dominic Riley. I don't remember the name off the top of my head, but it was from 2009, and it's available to members of the Guild through their Vimeo website. I believe it is, the title is something to do with cloth rebacks.
Okay. Thanks, Noah. You're getting a lot of appreciation as well here. Let's see if there's any. Okay, James is asking what brand of watercolors you use.
Oh, I would have to go look at what I have at the moment. I don't remember. Off the top of my head, sorry.
Another question is, do you ever use Renaissance wax for adding sheen to Japanese paper to match leather sheen?
I don't use Renaissance wax. I will use SC6000 for that same purpose. And I find that you can even use SC6000 to give it Japanese paper a similar sheen to certain book cloths as well. Okay.
And I think we've got people sharing videos and so forth. I think those are all of our questions. Circling back to Rachel, she wrote in her original question, is there a reason you would lift the paste side versus the other side? Is it for the preservation of the front cover material? That was the clarification. Does that?
Okay. So the reason, so I would lift the paste down side for doing a hinge repair rather than the other side, just because that's structurally, that's where you want your hinge repair to be, on the inside of the board rather than on the outside. I think that answers the question.
Okay. Well, thank you, Noah. I think that's the end of our questions and probably the end of our time for questions. I will hand it back over to Andrew now.
Well, thank you so much, Noah. That was a really great presentation. I even learned a few tricks, which is great. Thank you all in the audience for joining us today, the start of our 3 days of presentations, and for the great questions that have come out of it. And again, once again, we'd like to thank our sponsors for helping us make this happen. We hope to see you in one of our classes at Book Paper Thread in the future. You can always follow us on social media at Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter, or you can join our email listserv on our website to get the latest news. Here are a few classes that we have coming up at Book Paper Thread if you want to try them out. Kakashibo and Washi with Linda Marshall starting February 27th. Books for Photographers and Printmakers with Andrew Hewitt starting March 3rd. And The Storage Book with Karen Hardy beginning March 27. Remember, you can find the recordings and any handouts of the instructors in the webinar tabs on the conference website. Just go to their individual names and they'll all be there. And if you have more questions or want to continue this discussion, be sure to go to the Continuing Conversations section in the conference website so you can post questions and make comments and continue this going on. So our next presentation will be a behind-the-scenes exploration of paper mechanisms with Sean Sheehy at 1 o'clock today. And finally, I just want to finish out mentioning you'll be receiving an evaluation after the conference, and we'd love to hear your feedback about the format and the content of this event. Thank you so much, and have a good afternoon.